Have you ever felt an invisible presence watching you? Have you ever heard whispers in an empty hallway? Hospitals, the places meant to heal, sometimes hold something darker, something that never left. When life and death collide within the sterile walls, strange things begin to happen. These are the terrifying true stories from those who have worked in hospitals, experienced the unexplainable, and lived to tell the tale. But be warned, after reading these, you may never look at a hospital the same way again. Story 1. The Screaming Room. I used to work the night shift at a now abandoned psychiatric hospital. It was an old facility, built in the 1920s, and it had seen its fair share of horrors. The place had a reputation. Patients talked about hearing whispers, doors slamming on their own, and seeing shadows where no one should be. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced in the West Wing. There was a room 502, that was always locked. Always. No patients were housed there, and no one spoke about it. But every night around 2:30 a.m. we would hear screaming coming from that room. Blood-curdling, agonizing screams. It would go on for minutes, and then silence. Security would check, but the room was always empty. One night I had enough. I asked an old nurse about it, and she paled. "They locked someone in there a long time ago," she whispered. "A patient who never stopped screaming, even after she died." That night I stood outside room 502 at 2:30 a.m. The screaming started, echoing through the hall. My body froze, but I forced myself to look through the small window in the door, and I saw her. A woman with hollow eyes, her mouth twisted open in an endless scream. She turned her head slowly, locking eyes with me. The next thing I remember, I was on the floor, a nurse shaking me awake. The door was still locked and the room was empty, but the screaming never stopped. Story 2. The Shadow in the Basement. Every hospital has a basement, a place where old records are kept, where outdated equipment gathers dust. At my hospital, the basement was strictly off-limits. The locks were rusted, the lights barely worked, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and something else, something rotten. One night, I was sent down there to retrieve a file. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. A presence. The hairs on my arms stood up. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw something move in the darkness. Then a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but no one came. My flashlight flickered again, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the darkness around it. It stood at the far end of the room, watching. Then it moved. The next thing I remember, I was outside the basement door, gasping for breath. No one could explain how I got out. But I'll never forget the feeling of something breathing down my neck, whispering as I fled. Story 3. The Patient Who Wasn't There. One of the eeriest experiences I ever had working in a hospital involved a patient who wasn't there. We had received a new admission, an elderly woman who had been found wandering the streets, confused and muttering about them. She had no family, no records, no identification. We placed her in a secure room, gave her a meal, and let her rest. The next morning she was gone. The room was locked from the inside, the bed still made. The security cameras showed no one entering or leaving. It was as if she had vanished. But at night we could hear her voice. "They're coming," she would whisper. "They're always watching." Then one night we found her, or at least her body, buried deep in the hospital's old records, in a room that hadn't been opened in decades. She had been a patient in the 1960s. She had never left. Story 4. The Hands Under the Bed. Some patients see things that aren't there. Others see things that we wish weren't there. One patient, a young girl, was admitted after she stopped speaking altogether. Her parents claimed she refused to sleep in her bed, saying, "The hands will get me." We assumed it was childhood trauma. That was until one of the nurses saw them too. She was checking on the girl late one night when the child sat up suddenly, staring at the floor. "They're coming," she whispered. The nurse bent down to assure her everything was fine. That's when she saw the fingers, long bony fingers curling out from underneath the bed, gripping the mattress. She screamed and yanked the girl away. Other staff ran in, turning on all the lights. There was nothing there. But the child never slept in a bed again. Story 5. The Elevator That Never Stops. In the oldest part of the hospital, tucked away in a dimly lit corridor no one visits, there's an elevator that no one uses. The metal doors are rusted shut, the call button's long dead. The hospital administration officially marked it as out of service years ago. And yet some nights, especially around 3 a.m., it dings, and the doors open. Most people ignore it, pretending they didn't hear the soft chime echoing down the hall. But the janitor on the night shift, Raoul, wasn't like most people. He was new, unfamiliar with the old stories whispered among staff. When he heard the ding, curiosity got the better of him. He turned the corner and saw the impossible. The rusted doors, once sealed tight, were now open. The interior lights flickered weakly, casting long, stretching shadows against the walls. Raoul hesitated. Then, against all instincts, he stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the doors snapped shut with a force that sent a gust of cold air through the hallway. The old buttons, once dead, flickered to life. But instead of floors, they displayed symbols he didn't recognize. Strange, twisting characters that seemed to shift when he tried to focus on them. The elevator lurched downward. Raoul's stomach twisted as the numbers above the door began to count down. B1, B2, B3. The hospital only had one basement. B4, B5. The air grew colder, the light dimmer. His breath fogged in front of him. Then the elevator stopped. The doors slid open, revealing an impossible corridor bathed in sickly yellow light. The walls pulsed as if breathing. A distant rhythmic sound echoed down the hall, something between a heartbeat and dragging footsteps. Raoul stepped back, hand slamming the closed door button. Nothing happened. A shadow moved in the hallway. Tall, wrong, stretching too far. The security cameras caught the elevator doors opening again minutes later on the ground floor. The janitor was gone. The footage showed only an empty shaft. Hospitals are places of healing, but they also hold the echoes of those who never left. Some patients linger, some shadows watch, and some doors should never be opened. So the next time you find yourself in a hospital late at night, listen closely. Because if you hear whispering or a door opens by itself, you might not be alone, and you might not be able to leave. Do you have the courage to share your own paranormal hospital experience? Let us know, but be warned, once you speak of them sometimes, they listen.